And getting settled down. All right, this next topic is on, we'll call it day-to-day life more so. And the speaker is Marvin Yoder. I'm blessed to be able to call him my father. And Marvin Yoder and his wife Mildred live in the village of St. Paul that has historically, or was historically known as Keim. It's a location that's central to the early Amish and Mennonite settlement of Somerset County's Elklick Township. They have 3 children and 2 grandchildren. He is a graduate of Eastern Mennonite College, now Eastern Mennonite University, and he served over 40 years as a teacher, including 35 years as a teacher and a principal at Mountain View Christian School in Springs, Pennsylvania. And he was there to help bring that school into existence in 1973, and then retired from that position in 2008. And I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to share. And there might be some issues with the technology. We want to play a couple of videos, and so we may have to do some funky things to get the sound to play. So we'll see how that works. But would you come ahead and share what you have to share? When you get to the videos, I'm just going to come up here and we'll play the videos through the speaker, and I'll use a handheld mic to get the sound.
Okay. Well, good evening. I found this to be a challenging topic because I had never really studied about these kinds of things during this time period. And so I hope what I've discovered can be of some benefit to you. I want first of all to give some acknowledgments. I'd like to recognize Jennifer Hurl, archivist at Marsdale Public Library, who was very helpful in giving me information and helping me find resources. Unfortunately, I didn't know soon enough all the resources that Casselman Chronicles has available, or might have been able to find more information there. It was Jennifer that pointed me to this Sugar Camps to Star Barns by Sally McMurray, and her second chapter, Farming Country from 1820 to 1880, was very helpful. I'd like to acknowledge Jim Yoder for a paper that he gave me that contains 3 letters by Christian Yutzi, which he talked about earlier briefly. And I'd like to recognize my son Kenton for helping me with organizing the PowerPoint and especially the videos. And I'd also like to say at this point that most of my information is primarily on Somerset County. I didn't find much information on Garrett County, maybe because I didn't look at the right places, but most of my information is on Somerset County, so it is not primarily on the Amish Mennonite community, but I trust that the resources and methods used by the general community are not too much different from what the Amish Mennonites would have done, because I learned that during that time period, a lot of the local people could also speak the Pennsylvania German. So I'm assuming that there's some connection there. I found this statement in a Cassleman Chronicles article by Milton Beechey. Der Landbau ist die gesundeste, die nützlichste und die edelste Beschäftigung des Mannes. Credited to George Washington. I had no idea that he could even speak German. But it means farming or agriculture is the most wholesome, the most profitable or useful, and the most noble employment of man. Few political events that happened during this time period. Andrew Jackson was elected president in 1828. The railroad era began in 1830, but there were no railroads in this community yet at that point. Whig Party was formed in 1834. Republic of Texas established 1835. Mexican War 1846 to 48, and gold was discovered in California in 1849. During this period, land was still being cleared. There was more forested land than cultivated land, and when land was cleared, stumps and roots had to be dug out by hand, and I assume were removed by horsepower. In 1830, the population of Somerset County was nearly 18,000, 20,000 in 1840 and 24,000 in 1850. Now, you realize that that's a whole lot more than the Amish Mennonite community that James just told us about a little while ago, so I'll have to leave that for what it is. Cleared acreage was nearly 80,000, and houses outnumbered cabins. The core of the county's industry still catered in agriculture, grain milling, and wool processing dominated. Water-powered mills provided essential services such as cutting lumber, carding wool, fulling cloth, grinding flour, and pressing oil. And I'm not sure if that last comment applies to the Amish Mennonite community, whether they took advantage of all these things or not. But that was true of the Somerset County in general. In Somerset County, there were 1,656 farms according to the 1850 census. Number of improved acres, 165,600. Unimproved, 210,000, almost 400. 230 acres per farm. Average farm value, $2,249 or $10 per acre. Anybody want to buy a farm at that price? And then the value of farming implements, $10,077 per township. And Elk Lick and Summit Township were quite a bit above average. Now, I suppose if this is true of Somerset County, if we included Garrett County, those numbers could probably be doubled. And it certainly is much more than the Amish Mennonite community would have had. But the figures down below here on implement value and so on might apply. I don't know how much time I should spend on this, just to note a few things. Notice that in the 1840 census, there were 8,400 horses and mules, but in 1850, there were no mules, but still 7,000 horses, so that indicates a transition. In 1840, there were no milk cows. In 1850, 11,000. Notice the decline in swine, nearly a 50% decline, which I'm not able to explain. Notice the absence of oxen. No oxen are mentioned, but by the late 1840s, I read somewhere that depictions of oxen were replaced by depictions of horses in almanacs. That comes from Sally McMurray's book. Here's just one example. In 1850, the John Ann Beakley farm in Brothers Valley Township had 9 horses, 10 cows, 33 sheep, and 21 pigs. They raised grain, churned 800 pounds of butter, made wine, maple sugar, and also had a smokehouse on the property. So their farm had quite a few more than the average. Here are some grain statistics for Somerset County. Let me just point out a few things. Barley dropped from 730 bushels to 84 bushels. Hay increased by nearly 2,000 tons. But notice flax dropped from 39 tons to 6 4/10 tons. But maple sugar increased by almost 100,000 pounds. Now that's Somerset County, but again, I assume that our many Amish Mennonite people were growing some of the same products. I put this picture in because I wondered if this is why there was some decline in certain areas. The weaving house here was built in 1824, just at the time when homemade cloth was in decline in most areas. Yet it was used for weaving for several decades. So I'm a little doubtful whether Amish Mennonite communities were taking advantage of these things, but that may explain some of the decline in the previous slide. Although dairying was not a big business, each farm probably produced milk, cream, cheese, butter, and buttermilk. Milt Beachy had records of butter shipments from Cumberland to Washington, D.C. by stagecoach as payment for rent on a tract of land. Pennsylvania Gazetteer says the chief rural business is grazing. The breed of cattle is somewhat peculiar, being very small-horned and is much esteemed. The butter is of excellent quality and exported in large quantities. Glade butter from the country fetched good prices in Baltimore, Pittsburgh, and Philadelphia, markets serving the expanding urban and non-agricultural population. I highlighted that statement because, again, I wonder if that explains some of the decline in production that I noticed earlier. And this Glade butter would have come from the Berlin, Pennsylvania area. Oh, the previous slide there mentions that it was shipped by turnpikes. That would have included the National Road, which is now Route 40. Butter was churned mostly by the women folk, by dash-style churns, and tubs and kegs for storage and shipping were made locally. Butter was accepted by local merchants in trade. There's a photograph of a butter churn. Notice the square dasher. Here is a photograph of the one right up here with the dasher exposed, a different kind of dasher. Here is a picture of the top of the churn to show how the dasher moved up and down through the lid to allow the butter to be churned. Here is yet a third style of churn. I don't know what date this is, but I suppose it may have also been used during this time period. This is information from the letter, or paper rather, that Jim Yoder made available to me, that has 3 letters by Christian Yutzi, who emigrated in 1833. His son Peter Yutzi had a farm, probably in Elklick Township, and I think Jim mentioned that. He had 130 acres, of which 70 were cleared. On the farm were 16 beef cattle, 3 horses, 9 pigs, and 16 sheep. Christian helped by digging out tree stumps and stones. Another son, Daniel Yutzi, lived in Greenville Township near Pocahontas. He had 2 cows and 4 pigs and operated a distillery. In 1833, Daniel harvested a large crop of apples from which he made 15 barrels of brandy. And in 1835, 6 bushels of grain yielded 22 to 23 gallons of whiskey, which sold at 40 cents a gallon. The best income source was butter, which was sent to Baltimore and sold for 14 cents a pound. I'm not sure, well, we'll skip that, but somewhere the 1850 census said that there was no wine made in Somerset County in 1840 and 1850. So I don't know what the contradiction is here, if this Daniel Yutzi made brandy and whiskey, and I don't know how he used it. Maybe they were very conservative in their consumption of these things. I don't know the answer to that, but there seems to be a slight contradiction there unless whiskey and brandy are not considered as wine. Anyway, according to Christian Yutzi, wheat sold for 20 cents a bushel in 1841. up to 80 cents in 1845. Corn dropped 10 cents a bushel. Oats really went up to 20 cents a bushel, and whiskey dropped to 34 cents per gallon. So I'm assuming either a lot was available or they didn't produce as much. Now let's look at the structure of their barns. This is a classic Pennsylvania barn, and if I remember correctly, Jonas Beechey was the great-grandfather of Milton Beechey, whom some of us older people remember. In 1841, Jonas built a new barn 100 feet by 40. There were mouths at each end constructed of large logs. The rafter plates above the walls were 12 by 12 inch logs, 51 feet long, 2 on each side. Good sizable trees. Rafters were round poles with 4-inch diameter, flat on one side. Lath, 1 inch by 2 inch, were nailed to the rafters, and white pine shingles finished the project. The front of the barn was dressed stone 9 or 10 feet high, laid up with clay and mixed with horsehair and hog bristles. The cattle were in the lower part of the barn, which had a dirt floor except for the cow stable, which had concrete gutter and a walkway. Cow stable had the only window, 27 inches square. All doors were Dutch doors, and there was no running water in the barn. A Dutch door is one that can open both the top and the bottom. It's in two parts, a top, bottom, and a top door and a bottom door, and you can open the top door for ventilation and lighting, especially if you don't have windows. Here's a diagram of such a barn, probably not the same one, but over here there are heifers. Here's an aisle for feeding. Cows are in the middle. Another aisle here, horses here on the left, and calves here. I notice the calves don't have any doors, so maybe they could roam as they wished. And here in the feeding aisle, they could feed the horses and the cows or the heifers as they chose. Notice the doors here in the front, and notice the foreshoot. All these classic Pennsylvania barns were built in this fashion. And here is a picture of one. It's not the same barn, nor necessarily the same date, but you can see here is a buggy, here is a wagon, and this is the foreshoot that is mentioned, and here on the side you can see the stone foundation on which the barn is built. And of course up above they would have had hay and grain and such like things. Milt Beechey says that at the bottom of the hill there was a log cabin. I'm not sure if this is the same log cabin that Jim showed or not. It's certainly deteriorated, but it probably was livable at one time. Here's a cabin from North Carolina that looks quite a bit better. I don't know if the Somerset County cabins looked anything like that or not. Milton Beechey also describes a newer house made of upright wooden planks with strips of wood over the cracks between the boards. It was unfinished inside and out, had 2 stories and a basement, and cost about $700 to build. It also had a summer house or a kitchen in the yard and an ice house and a coal shed. This next picture is of a house built in 1860, apparently, and I simply put that in to show the contrast between this and the 1860 dwelling. It shows a considerable time of upward mobility, I would say, in the community. And I don't know if our Amish Mennonite communities did similar things or not, but there's still houses that look very similar to that in the area. Now looking at some agriculture methods. Before 1830, farmers in Britain and North America used cast iron plows. The woodcock plow had wooden beams and handles, but the rest was cast iron. It was certainly better than the wooden moldboard plow, but it still had significant problems. it couldn't cut very well through rocky ground or grassland. And so when John Deere invented the first successful steel-tipped walking plow in the 1830s, that was quite an improvement. And other inventors were also attempting to use similar technology. Here's a picture from the Casselman Chronicles of a farmer with a plow, plowing with horses, and I would guess he's an Amishman just looking at him. So that's probably how they did their plowing. Here is a video. Let's see. So we're not sure how the people of this time period seeded their fields. They may have just done it by hand, just scattering the seed as they walked along and then trying to cover it some way. Or they may have used something like this Unicode seed sower. The seed is put into this bed.
I can play the audio from up here
Oh, you can?
on the computer. If you can play it and the video from up there, and I'll play the audio from back here.
Okay. Let's try that again then, see what happens.
You don't want this.
No, we don't. Okay, now we go here.
So we're not sure how the people of this time period seeded their fields. They may have just done it by hand, just scattering the seed as they walked along and then trying to cover it some way. Or they may have used something like this Unicode seed sower. The seed is put into this bag, and then the strap is put over your head. And there's a little lever here on the side that opens an opening in the bottom that allows the seed to drop on this spreader. And then you just turn this wheel or this handle while the seed is spreading or dropping onto the spreader, and that spreads the seed over the field. And then I don't know how they covered it necessarily, but that's one possibility. I read about one farmer who took a large thorn bush and tied it behind his horse and drug it over the land to cover the seeds after he had apparently spread them. Jethro Tull invented a seed drill in England in 1701, and it was a one-row planter, I guess you would say. And I don't know if these kinds of machines were brought into the United States or not. I suppose they may have been. The horse-drawn seed drill was invented by Jethro Tull in England in 1701, and in the mid-1800s, a George Van Brunt developed an American model and merged with John Deere in 1911. Here's an example of Mr. Tull's original device, 1705 model. Here's a later version, has about 6 rows, and here is a still later version that we would have used even when I was growing up. So I'm not sure how our local Amish Mennonites seeded their land, but those are some possibilities. Then when the grain was harvested, they used the word escapes me. Cradle, thank you. They used a cradle. Here along the bottom you see the scythe part that cuts the grain, and these devices here hold the grain so that it can be laid out in neat rows, as we'll see a little later. Here is one being used. The blade is here, and these 4 extensions there hold the grain as it is laid out. Here are 3 farmers cradling grain, and notice how it falls into nice rows when they are finished, and then somebody has to come along and gather up the grain into sheaves and tie it with a band of grain and then put it up into shocks. Here is a short video of a man using a scythe. And notice how it lays the grain into rows. When hay was harvested, the grass was cut with a scythe and laid in swaths. Children would follow using forked sticks to lift the hay for better drying. When the hay was dry, it was raked into stacks, and the chain was put around the stacks, and they were pulled into the barn. From a Cassleman Chronicles article by Oleta Daniels. When grain was harvested, the cradle was used, and the grain was laid in rows, as you saw in the previous photo. Then it was gathered into sheaves, tied by hand using a band made of grain stalks. The sheaves were stacked into shocks and then taken into the barn for threshing after it was dry. This is compliments of a farmer in Summit Mills. Still in 2022, we are still seeing shocks. Cyrus McCormick, a blacksmith in Virginia, developed the first practical mechanical reaper to harvest grain in 1831. His father had tried and was not successful, but he worked in the blacksmith shop for about 6 weeks, I believe, and came up with something that he thought would work. So he took it out and tried it, and it did indeed work. Here is a photo of the first version. Notice here is a wheel that turns the thing that lays the grain down on this platform, and then a man has to walk beside the platform or beside the machine and rake the grain out into the field to tie it and shock it up, because it didn't have any way to do that. Here is a later version that has a platform for a man to stand on instead of walking beside it. And this says it's an 1847 model. I am not sure about that because of what this next slide will show. Need some audio.
Okay, folks, please, American history. That's in process here.
About 170 years old. 1840, not 1940. 1840.
Okay, he says it's an 1840 model. Notice this one has blades that sweep the grain off of the platform and onto the ground, which can then be picked up and tied into a sheaf and shocked. The reason I questioned the 1847 date on the previous model is because I think this one is more advanced than the previous one, so I'm not sure which date is right. When the grain was dry and it was taken to the barn for threshing, horses were used to tread the grain before the hand flail was used. Flails were made from hickory wood. They were about 3 feet long and 3 inches thick and were attached to a 5-foot handle by a leather thong. It was strenuous work, and the flailers often used chants of some kind with their work, like slop shoe, slop shoe, slop shoe. I have no idea where they came up with that kind of a chant. Here's a flail, but this one looks to me like it's attached with metal devices rather than a leather thong. So this must be a later version, or maybe just a model of some kind. Cassleman Chronicles, Milton Beechey describes what he calls a groundhog thresher, a spiked cylinder that carried the straw with the grain between another set of stationary spikes called a concave. This separated the grain from the straw, but the grain and chaff both fell to the floor and needed further cleaning. And this thresher was operated by geared horsepower, which we'll see in the next video. Audio, please. So that's what's called a horse thresher. I want to do that again and show you right here is a wheel, and if you look carefully, you can see a shaft that I think runs underground to the thresher, which is actually not on the picture itself. So if I hit this, will it go again? Nope.
Can you go up? There. Now try.
So there you see the wheel, and there, if you look carefully, you can see the shaft turning. So that's the horse thresher. And here is an other thresher that's out of our time period, but I thought it's so interesting that you would probably like to see it. It's also a horse thresher, but the horsepower is not the same by any means. The horses are on a treadmill that turn the machine. And this machine does separate the straw from the grain. This is an 1854, I'm sorry, that's the next slide. I think this is sometime 1850 or 1860 maybe. There the grain is coming out the side. Pretty unique how they did these things. In 1834, John Avery and Hiram Pitts devised a significant improvement to a machine that separates grain from the chaff. They were granted United States patents in 1837. According to the photo, it was pulled by 10 horses. It looked little like a horse-drawn combine. I don't have a photo of that. Now, something about agriculture. In the year 1845, a Mr. Collins began burning lime near Myers Mills, which is now Myersdale, which no doubt was the first lime burned in the county. By this time, a large percent of the improved land had become exhausted of fertility, but farmers were slow to use lime because they weren't sure if it might injure the land. So one man did an experiment by using a half bushel in a fence corner and saw what results it would give. It's claimed that Brothers Valley Township is entitled to the credit for the first application of lime to the soil in the county. It was hauled in wagons from Cumberland about the year 1844, and I would just suppose that even Amish Mennonite farmers made use of it. Here's a picture of a lime kiln dated 1880, but there were similar structures in 1840 as well. Now we go on to maple sugaring, which was an important part of their livelihood. Originally, a gash was cut in the side of the tree, and the sap ran down the trunk into a wooden trough on the ground. The trough was made of basswood, about 5 feet long, 6 to 8 inches wide. Later, wooden spiles were made from elder and sumac wood with the pith burned out, and the buckets were commonly made by cutting cylindrical segments from a large tree trunk and then setting it up and hollowing out one side of the chunk to make a seamless, watertight container, which they probably set under the spouts. And this says wooden keelers came out about 1850. However, well, I'll get to that in a minute. Those who gathered the sugar water used sap carriers, which were hung on two ends of a shoulder yoke, probably also made from wood. And apparently the sap was often boiled right in the sugar woods. It was an important part of farming practice and provided significant income for the family. Local stores accepted sugar for cash or in exchange for goods. Now this wooden keeler I found is dated 1820. So I'm not sure who is right, whether it was 1850 or 1820, but maybe there were some during this time period. Here's a very grainy photograph of what I suppose was boiling the sugar in the sugar woods. Notice two logs here on either side of the fire pit, and these, I want to say stainless steel, cast iron. These cast iron tubs were used to boil the water, and this man is stirring it, and I'm not sure, is that man making spatza by cooling some of it in the snow? I'm not sure. In the fall, there were numerous apple schnitzings, corn huskings, and butcherings. Orchards were planted during this time period, and as the orchards matured, family members busied themselves picking the apples, and then they also dried the apples for schnitz, and they made some cider and processed it into vinegar and apple butter. And the apple butter, of course, was made with long boiling and stirring over an open fire with a cast iron kettle, similar to what we saw in the previous picture. Apple butter was stored in crocks for sale and home use. This is called a wine press, but I don't see why it couldn't have been used as a cider press just as well. This represents the corn huskings. The corn was cut, I suppose, with a sickle maybe, and put into shocks, and then in a fall evening, the young people had a social gathering and husked the corn when it was dry. At butchering time, it was the men's responsibility to do the killing, cutting, and gutting, and the women did the cleaning, scraping, and cooking. One man slaughtered a steer raised by a Jonas Friedlein in Somerset Township. The forequarters weighed 960 pounds, the head and shank 110, the hide 112, for a total of 1,182 pounds. Mr. Friedlein estimated it cost him $10 to raise the steer, and he sold it for $45. Pretty good profit. Here's a picture of what I think is a pig butchering, old time. And here is yet another. This is a Dutch oven. How did they do their baking? I don't know if any of you have used a Dutch oven or not, but they put it in their open fireplaces on the coals and also heaped coals on top of the lid, and that's how some of them did their baking. The first cooking stoves were developed in the 1760s, but in the early 1800s, many patents were granted for cook stoves, beginning the rush to develop an efficient and functional cook stove that could gain wide acceptance, but there were numerous obstacles. There was considerable angst beginning in the mid-1800s about the impact of the stove on home life. Some people believed the disagreeable odors and bad air and smoke from stoves were harmful to health. Others, mainly men, sentimentalized the open fire of the old fireplaces, believing that adopting a cook stove would ruin domestic life and social intercourse that occurred in the glow of the open fire. Others believed the energy emanating from an open fire nurtured the human spirit. I don't know which position our Amish Mennonite people took. Women were eager to adopt the cook stove. They had long endured the hot, smoky, and heavy labor of open hearth cooking and suffered health death. In the 17th century, that was the principal cause of death, second to childbirth. Women frequently burned holes in their aprons and skirts from the sparks of the open fires. And of course, the eating style changed because with the open hearth cooking, you had about one pot meals, whereas the cook stove allowed for a variety of dishes. Here's a photo of an 1840 cook stove, not very functional anymore. Here's one that is much nicer. It's called a step-top style. Notice right here is one door that probably allowed for a fire in this part, and here, of course, is another part. I wondered if they did their baking in here on this grill or this grate. Here is an old lamp by compliments of Ken and Ruth Yoder. I suppose they used lard or fat. And forgive me, I forgot to check when oil lamps were first introduced. Does anybody have an idea when oil lamps were first introduced? Okay, I do not know. I'm sorry, I missed looking that up. Most homesteads of this time period had a water trough in a spring house or in the basement, designed in such a way that water from the spring ran through the trough continuously, and it was used to cool milk and other products. The spring house was used in much the same way we use a refrigerator, and the temperature of the water was about 55 degrees. Most houses at this time did not have hot water, so water was brought in from outside and heated on the stove, and then used for doing dishes, laundry, and even baths. And baths were even taken in the laundry tub. Here's a picture of a stone spring house on an abandoned farm. This was taken somewhere in Pennsylvania. I don't know where. Here's another photo of a basement in some forest. Notice the stairway coming down into the basement, and here is the opening of the spring house where they would have kept their products that they wanted to cool. This is a fancy spring house. I don't know where it's located. Now we go to linen processing. There are 8 steps listed here to linen processing. I'm not going to go over each step because I have a video that shows the processes from planting to hackling. Here is an old photo that comes from Pioneer Life in the Yawk region by J.O. Arnold. On the left, it shows breaking the flax, and on the right, it shows hackling the flax. And we'll see this process in the next video. So here is the planting. Doing it by hand. This video was made in Ireland, did I tell you? Now this is the harvesting. Notice how he ties this with a strand of grain. That's the way they used to tie their sheaves of grain. Retting is soaking the flax in water. That helps to loosen up the fibers of the plant. Then they have to take it out, spread it, and dry it again. And they have to gather it a second time and tie it into a sheaf. That was supposed to be edited out. I'm not sure what happened. And I'm not sure how to speed it up. And then they have to break down the fibers.
This must have been done like this here up until.
I think he says this method was used until 1830, but I suspect it was used even later. This is to loosen the main part of the plant so that you can get to the linen fibers inside. Then he does the crimping or breaking. And he calls this brushing, I think it's called, what is it, hacking or something like that? I'm not sure. All that work for a little bit of linen fiber.
That's it, pure linen.
So maybe that's why they stopped growing so much flax. Here's another photo of a demonstration of the breaking and combing the flax. Then the wool processing, again, has 6 steps here: shearing, grading, washing, blending, dyeing, etc. But sometimes the washing and the shearing were reversed. I read somewhere that they often took sheep down to the pond or to the river, to a stream, and submerged the sheep into the water and scrubbed the wool to get rid of some of the dirt and other things. So they were washed before they were actually sheared. But here's a photo of a man shearing a sheep. Notice he's using a shears. They had no electrical clippers back then. Here's an 1830 model of a spinning wheel. Not too different from that one. Here's a photo of a demonstration spinning wheel. And here is a video again of a weaving process. How am I doing for
And
time?
so what we've got situated with our loom, we got it all warped up and tension is applied, so it's fairly similar along the way. We actually have to what's called spreading the work. So I have some waste yarn here. That's our bright blue. It's not part of our finished piece, but it just is part of that process of getting it finished. And then we are ready to do our weaving. I have what's called a boat shuttle, and it has a bobbin of thread in the middle of that, and that's going to feed off to create our threads that we have going acrosswise. And we are going to go through a series of movements with our loom. You can see down here at my feet, they have pedals, and these actually lift a portion of our threads up by pushing down with my foot in the situation and creating what we call our shed. And so if you look up here at the top, you can see by pushing down that one treadle, it is lifting and creating a space. Only portions of my threads are being lifted in the process. If I drop and do a second treadle, that lifts up a different set of threads along the way. And so my thread that I have on my shuttle will pass between these two layers of thread. So basically we have 3 down and 1 up in the situation, creating this particular pattern. So let me see where we're at. This is where our last one was, so we're going to move to our next one. We pick up the second treadle that we have in our pattern, pass that through. It's called a boat shuttle because it kind of floats on top of our threads that we have here. Bring that up in place, smooth that out, use what we call a beater, and that smooths our threads into line as it needs to be. Lift up our next shuttle, heddle, slide that shuttle through again, line up our threads, drop that down, beat it in place. Go with number 4, actually, is what we are at. Let that go through, drop, beat, come back to number 1, pass through, drop, beat, number 2, pass through, drop, beat.
Okay, I think we'll stop with that and go on. That gives you an illustration of the weaving process. So they first had to clean the wool or the flax and then spin it, I guess, into yarn or thread and then do the weaving. So that was quite an involved process. This is my last slide. I put this weaving house in here again because I think it illustrates what was happening throughout the community that caused some people to have questions and doubts. They did not, well, let me just read it. Many people were uneasy with the changes that were in the air. They objected to the loss of self-sufficiency, the impersonal nature of the caste system, and the erosion of communal prerogatives. The clash between traditionalists and consumers, evident in Somerset County, was played out all over the East Coast and I suppose throughout the Casselman Valley. Critics equated the consumption of factory-produced textiles with moral decline. And I wonder if some of our Amish Mennonite friends would have felt that way as well and felt that they were losing their independence and self-sufficiency by accepting some of the newer inventions and changes that were coming in. But on the other hand, I suppose that they probably used some of the farming technology and other things that were available to them as time went on. Do you have any questions that I can't answer?
Okay.
How do I get rid of this? Okay, is that it? Yeah.
All right. A big thank you to my dad for putting that together and for sharing that with us. Whenever I look at the process of creating homespun fabric, it is just a shocking amount of work. I cannot imagine. We have it so easy. Walk down to the fabric store, even if you want to make your own clothes as opposed to buying the ready-made. You walk to the fabric, or you drive to the fabric store and you buy lengths of fabric that have been manufactured for you in a mill somewhere. Starting from flax seeds to the final product is just a killer. Okay, thank you for your time and attention here tonight. Before we go partake of the refreshments downstairs, we want to lift an offering for anybody who wants to share in helping to pay for the expense of the building and the weekend. So if Bernard and his helpers could just pass the baskets, and it's a free will offering. If you want to, you may help with those expenses. If you aren't prepared to do that tonight and you plan to be here tomorrow, there will be an opportunity tomorrow as well, if you prefer. Also, I'd like to give a big thanks to Scott Brenneman for running the sound and for helping to record these things and for helping to make this possible, for working with Dad and I to make this presentation possible this evening. If you are interested in having any of the recordings, whether by video or in CD audio form or something like that, please see Bernard and Alice back at the table, and those are available for you to take along with you tonight before you leave, I believe. That's the plan. There are refreshments available in the basement, and I hope that you'll take advantage of those and visit with those people, that your friends and neighbors that are here this evening. Am I forgetting anything, Delvin or Bernard, that I... Yes, sir.
There'll be coffee and donuts tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock for delivery.
Thank you. There are coffee and donuts tomorrow morning beginning at 8 o'clock for you to avail yourself of before the meeting tomorrow morning. And the first session tomorrow morning is scheduled to be at 9 o'clock. Okay? And I hope to see you all here. All right. I think we'll just dismiss with that. So stand, stretch, head for refreshments, visit. Thank you so much for being here this evening. You may consider yourself dismissed.